She was 30 seconds away from the biggest mistake of her life. Nina stood outside the bridal suite, phone pressed to her ear, her mother's excited voice pouring through about last-minute guests. The hallway smelled of roses and champagne. Everything felt perfect. But when she pushed that door open 30 seconds earlier than expected, she saw something that would haunt her forever. Her best friend Tasha, the woman who knew every secret she'd ever whispered, was leaning over Nina's champagne glass, her hand trembling as she slipped something inside. Their eyes met. Tasha's face went pale, and in that frozen moment, Nina realized that the person she trusted most in the world had just become a stranger. Before we go any further into how it all started, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Maybe United States or United Kingdom or Canada or anywhere you're watching from, and what time is it there now? We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our videos. Have you subscribed to this channel now? If yes now, let's get started. Nina Martinez had spent her entire adult life believing in one simple truth. Loyalty was everything. She grew up in a small apartment in Chicago with a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Money was tight, but love was abundant. Her mother taught her that when you had nothing else, you had your word and the people who stood by you. That lesson shaped everything Nina became. By 29, she'd built a life she was proud of. She worked as a social worker, helping foster children find stable homes, and she'd met Marcus, a middle school teacher with kind eyes and a laugh that made her feel safe. Their relationship wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was steady, warm, the kind of love that felt like coming home. When Marcus proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in their kitchen, no fancy restaurant or grand gesture, just him and a ring and a promise, Nina said yes before he even finished asking. She'd finally found her person. She'd finally built the family she'd always dreamed of. Tasha Coleman had been in Nina's life since 4th grade. They met in Mrs. Patterson's class when Tasha was the new girl with braids and worn sneakers, sitting alone at lunch. Nina had walked over without hesitation, slid her sandwich across the table, and said, "You look like you could use a friend." From that day forward, they were inseparable. They shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about the future. Tasha was there when Nina's mother got sick during their senior year. She was there when Nina graduated college against all odds. She was the first person Nina called when Marcus proposed. Over the years, Tasha became more than a friend. She became family, the sister Nina never had. But looking back now, Nina wondered if she'd missed the signs. Small moments that didn't quite add up. The way Tasha's smile would tighten whenever Nina talked about Marcus. The strange comments she'd make. Little jabs disguised as jokes. Once after Nina showed her the engagement ring, Tasha had stared at it for a long time and said, "I hope he knows how lucky he is." Not everyone deserves this kind of happiness. At the time, Nina thought it was just Tasha being protective. Now, she wasn't so sure. The wedding morning started exactly the way Nina had imagined. Sunlight poured through the windows of the bridal suite at the Grand Oak Hotel. The room buzzed with energy as bridesmaids laughed, makeup artists worked their magic, and champagne bottles popped. Nina sat in the center of it all, wrapped in a white silk robe, her heart racing with anticipation. Her mother fussed over her veil, tears already streaming down her face. Her cousin played music from a portable speaker. Everything felt surreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake up from. Tasha had arrived early that morning, carrying Nina's favorite coffee and a box of pastries. She'd hugged Nina tight and whispered, "This is your day. You deserve every bit of happiness coming your way." But even then, something felt slightly off. Tasha's voice was too bright, her hug too stiff. Nina brushed it aside, blaming nerves. After all, this was a big day for everyone. The ceremony was set to begin in less than 2 hours, and Nina was doing her best to soak in every moment. Around mid-morning, the suite settled into a comfortable rhythm. The makeup artist finished Nina's face, and the photographer snapped candid shots of the bridesmaids laughing together. Someone poured champagne into crystal flutes, one for each woman in the room. Nina's glass sat on the vanity, bubbles rising slowly to the surface. She remembered thinking how beautiful it looked, how everything about this day felt touched by magic. Then her phone rang. It was her mother, calling from downstairs with a question about seating arrangements. Nina smiled apologetically at the room and stepped into the hallway to take the call. The conversation lasted maybe 60 seconds. Nothing important, just her mother's last-minute worries. Nina reassured her, laughed softly, and promised everything would be perfect. When she hung up, she turned back toward the suite, her hand already reaching for the door handle. But something made her pause. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the strange quiet that had settled over the room. She pushed the door open slowly, quietly, and that's when she saw it. Tasha was standing at the vanity, her back to the door, leaning over Nina's champagne glass. Her hand hovered above it, and in her fingers was a small glass vial, the kind you might find in a pharmacy. Nina's breath caught in her throat. For a second, she thought she was imagining it, that her mind was playing tricks. But then Tasha's hand moved, tipping the vial ever so slightly, and a few drops of clear liquid fell into the champagne. The sound of the door opening must have startled her because Tasha spun around, her eyes wide, her face drained of color. The vial disappeared into her palm so quickly, Nina almost doubted what she'd seen. Almost. The two women stood frozen, staring at each other across the room. The air felt thick, suffocating. Tasha's mouth opened, then closed. Her hands trembled, and Nina felt something inside her crack, something she didn't know could break. This was the woman she trusted with her life, the woman who'd held her hand through every hardship, and now on the most important day of her life. That same woman had just done something unthinkable. Nina's voice came out quieter than she expected, barely more than a whisper. "Tasha, what are you doing?" Tasha's eyes darted to the champagne glass, then back to Nina. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing, just... I thought I saw something floating in your drink. I was just checking." Her voice was too high, too rushed. Nina took a step closer, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What's in your hand?" Tasha's fingers tightened around the vial. "Nothing. You're being paranoid." But her voice cracked on the last word, and Nina knew. She knew this wasn't paranoia. She knew she'd just witnessed something deliberate, something planned. The other bridesmaids were still chatting near the window, oblivious to the tension crackling between Nina and Tasha. Nina's mind raced. What was in that vial? Why would Tasha do this? And more importantly, how long had she been planning it? Nina's hand shook as she reached for her champagne glass. Tasha moved to block her, but Nina was faster. She grabbed the glass and held it up to the light, studying it. It looked normal. It smelled normal. But she wasn't about to take any chances. "Show me what's in your hand, Tasha." Nina's voice was firmer now, steadier. Tasha shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Nina, please, you're overreacting." But Nina wasn't overreacting. Every instinct in her body screamed that something was horribly wrong. She set the champagne glass down carefully and stepped even closer to Tasha, lowering her voice so the others wouldn't hear. "If you don't show me right now, I'm calling security." Tasha's face crumpled. For a moment, Nina thought she might actually confess, might explain everything, and make it all make sense. But instead, Tasha turned and bolted toward the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. Nina stood there, stunned, her mind spinning. The room suddenly felt too small, too loud. One of the bridesmaids noticed the tension and walked over. "Everything okay?" Nina forced a smile. "Yeah, just... Tasha's not feeling well. I'm going to check on her." She knocked on the bathroom door, her hand trembling. "Tasha, open the door, please." Silence. Then the sound of water running. Nina's stomach twisted. What was happening? And how had her perfect day turned into a nightmare in the span of 60 seconds? Nina pressed her forehead against the bathroom door, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with Tasha over the past few months. She thought about the engagement party, how Tasha had barely spoken to Marcus all night. She thought about the bachelorette weekend, how Tasha had gotten drunk and said something strange. Something about how Nina always got what she wanted without even trying. At the time, Nina had laughed it off, thinking Tasha was just venting about her own dating struggles. But now those words took on a darker meaning. Now they felt like warnings Nina had been too blind to see. The bathroom door finally opened. Tasha's eyes were red, her face blotchy from crying. She looked small, broken. For a moment, Nina's anger wavered. This was still her best friend. This was still the girl who'd held her when her mother died. who'd celebrated every victory and mourned every loss. But then Nina remembered the vial, the champagne, the look of pure guilt on Tasha's face. She steeled herself. "Talk to me, please. What's going on?" Tasha's voice came out in a whisper. "I can't." Nina felt her frustration building. "You can't?" "Tasha, I just watched you put something in my drink on my wedding day. You owe me an explanation." Tasha sank down onto the edge of the bathtub, her head in her hands. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Finally, Tasha spoke, her voice so quiet Nina had to strain to hear. "I didn't want to hurt you. I swear I didn't." Nina's blood ran cold. "Then what did you want?" Tasha looked up, and the expression on her face was something Nina had never seen before. It was pain, yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like rage. "I wanted to stop this, all of this. The wedding, the marriage, everything." Nina felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Tasha opened her mouth, then closed it again. Tears streamed down her face. "Because he should have been mine." The words hit Nina like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "What?" Tasha was sobbing now, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Marcus, he should have been with me. I introduced you to, remember? That day at the coffee shop? I was supposed to meet him there, but I brought you along because I didn't want to go alone. And then he looked at you, and I saw it happen. I saw him fall for you right there, and I knew I'd lost him before I even had a chance." Nina's mind spun backward to that day 3 years ago. She remembered it clearly. Tasha had invited her out for coffee, said she wanted Nina to meet someone. Nina had assumed it was just a casual introduction, maybe a potential friend. She'd never imagined Tasha had romantic intentions. Marcus had been charming and funny, and yes, there had been an instant connection. But Nina had never known, never even suspected that Tasha had feelings for him. Why hadn't Tasha said something? Why had she let Nina pursue the relationship without ever speaking up? Nina's voice shook. "You never told me. All this time, you never said a word." Tasha wiped her eyes, her face twisted with anguish. "What was I supposed to say? You two were perfect together. Everyone could see it. And I thought maybe if I just stayed close, if I was supportive, eventually you'd break up, and he'd realize I was there all along. But you didn't break up. You got engaged, and I realized I was going to have to watch you marry the only man I've ever loved." Nina felt sick. Her best friend had been living in silent torment for 3 years, harboring feelings for Marcus while pretending to be happy for Nina. And now, on Nina's wedding day, that pain had finally erupted into something dangerous. Nina's voice was barely audible. "What was in the vial, Tasha?" Tasha's hands shook as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small glass container. She held it out to Nina. "It's a sedative, strong enough to make you feel dizzy, disoriented. I thought if you fainted before the ceremony, if there was some kind of medical emergency, maybe the wedding would be postponed. Maybe it would give me time to tell Marcus how I really felt. Maybe he'd realize he'd made a mistake." Nina stared at the vial in horror. Tasha had been planning to drug her, to sabotage her wedding, all because of feelings she'd never had the courage to express. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Nina couldn't even process it fully. She thought about all the times Tasha had helped her plan the wedding, had smiled and laughed and pretended to be excited. Every moment had been a lie. Every hug had been laced with resentment. Nina felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. She took the vial from Tasha's hand, her fingers trembling. "You need to leave." Tasha's face crumpled. "Nina, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I couldn't stand the thought of watching you walk down that aisle." Nina's voice hardened. "You were supposed to be my maid of honor. You were supposed to stand beside me today, and instead, you tried to ruin everything." Tasha reached for Nina's hand, but Nina pulled away. "Please don't do this. We've been friends for 20 years. You can't just throw that away." Nina felt something break inside her chest, something that could never be repaired. I'm not the one throwing it away, Tasha. You did that the moment you put something in my drink. The words hung in the air, final and unforgiving. Tasha stood slowly, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She looked like a ghost of the person Nina had known. Without another word, she walked past Nina, through the bridal suite where the other bridesmaids were still laughing and chatting, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off. Nina watched her leave, watched the door close behind her, and then she sank down onto the bathroom floor and let herself cry. Not because she'd lost a friend, but because she'd never truly had one to begin with. Everything she'd believed about Tasha, about their friendship, about loyalty and trust, had been built on a foundation of lies. And now, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, Nina had to face the fact that the person she'd loved like a sister had been quietly hating her for years. Nina sat on that cold bathroom floor for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Her mind kept replaying every memory she had of Tasha, searching for clues she'd missed. How many smiles had been fake? How many times had Tasha listened to Nina gush about Marcus while silently wishing he were hers instead? The thought made Nina's stomach turn. She heard a knock on the bathroom door. Her cousin's voice called through. "Nina? Honey, are you okay? We need to start getting you into your dress." Nina wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and stood. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her makeup was ruined, her eyes red and swollen. But beneath the tears, she saw something else. Strength, resolve. She wasn't going to let Tasha's betrayal destroy her wedding day. She wasn't going to give her that power. Nina opened the door and faced her cousin with as much composure as she could muster. "I'm fine, just needed a moment. Let's get me into that dress." Her cousin studied her face, clearly sensing something was wrong, but Nina shook her head. "I'll explain later. Right now, I just want to focus on marrying the man I love." And she meant it, because despite everything, despite the heartbreak and betrayal, Marcus was still waiting for her. Their love was still real, and that was worth celebrating. The ceremony took place exactly as planned, though Nina made some quick adjustments. She quietly informed the wedding coordinator that Tasha wouldn't be participating and asked her to rearrange the processional. Her bridesmaids asked questions, but Nina simply said Tasha had a family emergency and had to leave. She'd tell them the truth later, but not today. Today was about her and Marcus. As Nina stood at the back of the church, her arm linked through her uncle's, waiting for the music to begin, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She'd spent so much of her life believing that loyalty meant holding on to people no matter what. But now she understood that real loyalty was a two-way street. It required honesty, respect, and genuine love. Tasha had given her none of those things. When the doors opened and Nina began her walk down the aisle, she saw Marcus waiting for her at the altar. His eyes were bright with tears, his smile so full of love that Nina felt her own tears threatening to spill over. In that moment, everything else faded away. The betrayal, the hurt, the confusion. All that mattered was the man standing before her, the man who'd chosen her, loved her, and built a life with her. The man Tasha had wanted but never fought for. Nina had done nothing wrong. She'd simply fallen in love with someone who loved her back. And that was something worth celebrating. The reception was beautiful. Nina danced with Marcus under twinkling lights, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely cared about them. She laughed until her cheeks hurt, ate cake until she felt sick, and soaked in every moment of joy. But late in the evening, when the party began to wind down, Nina found herself standing alone on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Her mother joined her, wrapping a shawl around Nina's shoulders. "You've been quiet all night, baby. What's on your mind?" Nina hesitated, then told her mother everything. About Tasha, the vial, the confession. Her mother listened without interrupting, her face a mixture of shock and sadness. When Nina finished, her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Nina. I know how much she meant to you." Nina nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I keep wondering if I missed something, if I should have known." Her mother pulled back and looked Nina in the eyes. "You can't blame yourself for someone else's choices. Tasha made her decisions. She chose to hide her feelings, to let resentment build, and ultimately to act on it in a terrible way. That's not your fault. Nina knew her mother was right, but it didn't make the pain any less real. In the weeks following the wedding, Nina struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to reach out to Tasha to try to salvage something from their friendship. But another part, the part that remembered the vial and the betrayal, knew that some things couldn't be repaired. Trust, once shattered, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Tasha tried to contact her several times. Text messages, voicemails, even a handwritten letter delivered to Nina's apartment. Each message was an apology, a plea for forgiveness, an explanation wrapped in desperation. But Nina couldn't bring herself to respond. Not yet, maybe not ever. She needed time to heal, to process, to figure out who she was without the friendship that had defined so much of her life. Marcus was her rock during those difficult weeks. He listened without judgment, held her when she cried, and reminded her that she deserved better than what Tasha had given her. He also confessed something that stunned Nina. He'd always felt a strange tension from Tasha, a coldness beneath her smiles. He'd mentioned it to Nina once early in their relationship, but Nina had dismissed it, insisting Tasha was just protective. Now Marcus's instincts made perfect sense. He'd sensed what Nina had been too trusting to see. 6 months later, Nina was sitting in a coffee shop when she saw Tasha walk in. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Tasha looked different, thinner, older somehow, as if the weight of her actions had physically changed her. She approached Nina's table hesitantly. "Can I sit?" Nina wanted to say no. She wanted to protect herself from more hurt, but curiosity won out. She nodded. Tasha sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I've spent every day since your wedding wishing I could take it back. Not just what I did, but all of it. The jealousy, the resentment, the years I wasted being bitter instead of being honest." Nina studied her former friend's face. She looked sincere, but sincerity didn't undo the damage. "Why didn't you just tell me how you felt? Why did you let it get to that point?" Tasha's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of losing you completely if I admitted the truth. So instead, I lost you anyway, but in the worst possible way." Nina felt a pang of sadness, not for what they'd lost, but for what they'd never really had. Their friendship had been built on a lie, at least on Tasha's side, and that meant it was never as real as Nina had believed. "I don't hate you, Tasha," Nina said quietly, "but I can't be your friend anymore. What you did crossed a line I can't uncross. You tried to sabotage one of the most important days of my life because you couldn't face your own feelings. That's not something I can just move past." Tasha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm getting help. Therapy. I'm trying to work through why I did what I did, why I let things get so out of control. And I'm truly sorry, Nina, for everything." Nina felt a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but an ending. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for. She stood, gathering her things. "I hope you find peace, Tasha. I really do. But I need to move forward without you in my life." Tasha didn't try to stop her. She simply sat there watching as Nina walked away for the final time. And Nina didn't look back. She'd spent too much of her life looking backward, trying to make sense of a friendship that had been broken long before she realized it. Now she was ready to focus on the future, on the people who truly loved her, and on building a life free from the weight of betrayal. A year after the wedding, Nina and Marcus celebrated their anniversary with a quiet dinner at home. They talked about everything they'd been through, the highs and lows, the unexpected challenges and beautiful moments. Nina told Marcus that in a strange way, she was grateful for what had happened with Tasha. Not because she was glad it occurred, but because it taught her something crucial about herself. She'd always believed loyalty meant staying, no matter what. But now she understood that loyalty also meant knowing when to walk away. It meant protecting yourself from people who claimed to love you, but acted otherwise. It meant recognizing that some relationships, no matter how long they'd lasted, were toxic and needed to end. Marcus raised his glass. To moving forward, to building a life based on honesty and real love. Nina clinked her glass against his. To moving forward. And as they sat together in their small apartment, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Nina realized something profound. She was happy, truly, deeply happy. Not because everything had gone according to plan, but because she'd survived something painful and come out stronger. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to protect her peace, and to surround herself with people who genuinely cared about her well-being. What would you have done if you caught your best friend tampering with your drink on your wedding day? Could you have forgiven someone who harbored secret resentment for years while pretending to be your closest confidant? Think about the friendships in your own life. Are they built on honesty and mutual respect? Or are there cracks beneath the surface you've been afraid to examine? Nina's story reminds us that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal. But it also reminds us that we have the power to choose who we allow into our lives. We have the power to walk away from toxicity, even when it's wrapped in years of history and shared memories. Because at the end of the day, you deserve relationships that uplift you, not ones that secretly wish for your downfall. You deserve friends who celebrate your happiness, not ones who resent it. And you deserve to protect your peace, even if it means letting go of people you once thought you couldn't live without. If this story moved you, make sure you subscribe, because the next story will shake your heart even deeper than this one. We share real stories about real people facing unimaginable situations, and we'd love for you to be part of this community. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you thought about Nina's decision. Would you have handled it differently? We'll see you in the next one.